I'm Faiz Shakir.
I'm Amanda Littman, and this is Battleground.
This week on Battleground, Amanda Littman, my co-host, is getting hitched, so she is not around. I'll be talking with political philosopher and social justice expert Michael Sandel of Harvard University.
It's inspiring to encourage people to go get a college degree in hopes of individual upward mobility. But as a response to inequality, it's woefully inadequate.
Professor Sandel, welcome to the Battleground podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be with you. It's good to meet you finally after our exchanges.
You've written a wonderful new book called The Tyranny of Merit, and so I am eager to have this conversation with you. We're shaped by values that often are injected to us by family, by media shows around us, by politics, schools, a variety of factors. And one of those, always constantly applying this gentle pressure on us about how we might think in the society that we're in. And one of those values that has become imbued, particularly in modern American society, is that, hey, you work hard, you rise to the top, right? If you just pull yourself by your bootstraps, it's really just a matter of work ethic. If you work hard, you're going to get there and you can become a billionaire like Elon Musk or something. If not a meritocracy, if not, fierce battles, right? One-upsmanship over one another, trying to push each other down. What is the aspirational way in which we should think about relating to one another in a society?
It's worth distinguishing two different problems with meritocracy as we have it today. The first, and the most familiar, is that we don't live up to the meritocratic principles we profess. The idea of meritocracy says, very simply, that if chances are equal, the winners deserve their winnings. Well, chances are not equal, far from it. So the project of creating genuine equality of opportunity is far from complete, far from realized. But the second problem with meritocracy is that even if we could achieve it, even if we could realize a perfect meritocracy, the ideal itself is flawed. Why would even a perfect meritocracy be flawed? Because it's corrosive of the common good. And the reason it's corrosive of the common good is a meritocracy generates attitudes towards success that lead almost inescapably to the divide between winners and losers. Because if we really do earn our place, our success, our achievements, and the rewards the market showers upon the successful, if that's true, as it would be in a perfect meritocracy, then the successful can believe their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, something they deserve, and by implication, that those who struggle must deserve their fate as well. This is the logic, the moral logic, if you think about it, of a perfectly realized meritocracy. Perfecting the meritocracy is not an adequate answer to inequality, and it would not make for either a just society or a good society, a healthy, flourishing democracy.
There's this commentary in the public about, or in elite media, or you hear it on CNBC, there's a labor shortage out there, right? A labor shortage. But in fact, in my observation, what is going on is you see these heroes, the essential workers, standing up in a way that we may have not seen in prior generations and saying that condition in that workplace, if it is not paying me a living wage, if it is not providing childcare, I'm going to choose no. I'm going to say that if that employer doesn't raise the bar for me, I will find someone else to work for, or I will stay home. And I think that revolution is a healthy thing.
Yes, I think it's encouraging for all the reasons that you've just suggested. But there's a subtler shift that I've noticed, which takes us back to the hold of meritocratic and technocratic ways of thinking about the economy and about government over the past 4 decades. Joe Biden, when he was nominated, became the first Democratic nominee for president in 36 years without an Ivy League degree.
I say it's about time that a state school president sat in the Oval Office.
He seems to be less wedded to the meritocratic solution to structural inequality. Because what has the Democratic Party, the mainstream Democratic Party, had to offer over the past 4 decades in response to the widening inequality instead of confronting it directly and dealing with inequalities of income and wealth and power. What they've offered instead, the idea of individual upward mobility through higher education, as if that were a satisfactory answer to 4 decades of wage stagnation and job loss. If you want to compete and win in the global economy, we were told, go get a college education. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. We heard these slogans again and again. Now, on the face of it, it's inspiring to encourage people to go get a college degree in hopes of individual upward mobility. But as a response to inequality, it's woefully inadequate. Not only that, there's an implicit insult in it. The insult is this: if you didn't go to university, and if you're struggling in the new economy, your failure is your fault. You didn't pull yourself up. You didn't improve yourself sufficiently to compete in the global economy. That insult took a toll. And it took a toll especially on the support of working people for the Democratic Party, so that by 2016, the Democratic Party was more attuned to the interests and outlook and values of the well-educated, well-credentialed professional classes than to the blue-collar voters who, since the New Deal, constituted its base.
Can I interrupt right there, Professor?
Yeah.
Because you have this paragraph in your book. More than any other aspect of his political rhetoric, you write, President Obama's constant talk of quote-unquote smart policies highlighted the connection between technocracy and meritocracy. For Obama, quote-unquote smart was the ultimate term of praise. He used the words, quote unquote, smart diplomacy, smart foreign policy, smart regulations, smart growth, smart climate policy, and so on and so forth. There's a lot more examples of it. But I do think that what you've hit on there is the way, it's not just the language. These ideas are not necessarily populist in that they will help everybody rise or, it will help the working class succeed. It is that they are smart. And because they are smart, they appeal to a certain portion of this populace more. And that rhetoric, I assume you believe, Biden has kind of moved away from, but that is what you're really confronting in many ways, right? In policy design and policy articulation, this idea that we target it to the smart and we do things in a quote unquote smart way.
Yes. And this rhetoric creeps up on us so subtly for a time that we scarcely notice it. But what's damaging about it is it encourages a technocratic way of conceiving the public good. If the choice between this public policy and that is simply figuring out which one is the smart one, or the efficient one, or the one that the experts would endorse, this relegates decision-making to experts, to technocrats, to the credentialed, to people who can identify the smart policies. And by implication, it drains politics of ideological contest and conviction. And it leads to a kind of complacence also among those who think it's enough to describe a policy as smart from making the argument, the moral and civic argument for this tax policy or that tax policy. And this credentialism also has, almost without our noticing it, shaped who gets to be in representative government. Those of us who spend our time in the company of the credentialed can easily forget that most Americans do not have a 4-year college degree. Nearly
2/3, right? I believe, of the American workforce.
Nearly 2/3 do not. Look at the backgrounds of people who are in the Senate and in the Congress, in the House, and for that matter, in state legislatures. So the majority of Americans don't have a 4-year college degree. Almost none of them, just a tiny handful of them, make their way into elected office. And the result is that working people constitute about half of the country. But they only account for 2%, people with backgrounds in working class background, 2% of the members of Congress, and even in state legislatures, which would seem to be closer to the people, only 3%. it generates resentments because this does not go unnoticed. One of the most potent sources of Trump's appeal was his appeal to grievances, the sense that elites are looking down on us.
You know, when they talk about the elite. The elite. Do you ever see the elite? They're not elite. You're the elite. You are the elite.
This sense of grievance, of demoralization, of humiliation, of anger was not misplaced. There was plenty in Trump's political appeal that was odious and racist. But his ability to tap in to this sense of grievance, Democrats had better figure out the source of those grievances. Really, to be free requires that we think of ourselves as democratic citizens with a meaningful voice in shaping the forces that govern our collective destiny.
I see in your book a really wonderful criticism of liberalism gone astray and losing its roots and its philosophical moorings. And I think I was left, upon reading it with this lingering question in my mind, which is, if liberalism is failing, can we assume, or should we assume, that conservatism, as identified by Donald Trump in this case, are they doing something right? Is it merely that the failure of liberalism has ceded the battleground and the playing field to the right and they've taken advantage of it? Or are they doing something affirmatively? Are they doing something right that we need to heed? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Politically, yes. In terms of policy, no. So what I think the Democrats need to learn, first they need to notice that they somehow managed to alienate working people. Now, part of it, and I can hear some friends saying, yeah, but that's because Trump appealed to racism. And he certainly did. But that's not the whole story. And that is that the Democratic Party has promoted policies, a version of neoliberal finance-driven globalization, that rightly drove out and alienated many working people, to say nothing of the insult of the meritocratic way of responding to the inequalities that resulted from those policies. So what the Republicans have done right has been really more in the political, rhetorical level,
the theater,
identifying this resentment. Now, in office, Trump's policies, he was a plutocratic populist. His policies essentially...
More billionaires in his cabinet, I think, than any point in American history.
Yeah, and he wanted to get rid of the health care that was helping the very people whose resentments he tapped into. So in terms of his policies, no. I think what Democrats can learn is that, first, Democrats need to reconnect with working people. And second, they need to do it in a way that addresses structural reform of the economy, not just offering individual upward mobility through higher education. Now, this involves raising fundamental questions about who contributes what, really, to the economy and to the common good. What about the outsized role that finance has come to play in recent decades in the economy? And so, for example, I think we should have a debate about taxation, beginning with this question. Why is it that we tax earnings from labor at a higher rate than earnings from capital gains and dividends? Why is that? Because implicitly, that way of taxing implies that what working people do actually is worth less than what people engaged in finance contribute. Here's another example. What about shifting in the tax system, shifting the burden of taxation from labor to financial speculation, wealth, and for that matter, a carbon tax, as a way of expressing the dignity of work? We've outsourced our judgment about what contributions really matter to markets. But the market's verdict is flawed. If the market were an accurate measure of social value, then we would have to agree that what a hedge fund manager contributes or a high-speed trader contributes is 900 or 1,000 times more valuable than what a teacher contributes or a nurse. But we know that's not the case.
Professor Sandel, I just would love for you to reflect on how we could animate this policy design, or do we need to animate the policy that we're doing for the working class with, in my words, animating it with friction, with taking on corporate elites, with finding essentially the villains who stand in the way of progress?
Yes, I think part of an effective political rhetoric for a revitalized democratic politics has to take on sources of power, elites, including corporate elites, including the role the financial industry plays very often in frustrating democracy. I think that's important. I think there's another element that's been missing in Democratic Party's, the Democratic Party's political rhetoric, and that's a broader moral vision of solidarity. The Democratic Party has been very alive to questions of distributive justice and inclusion, and those are certainly moral issues of great importance. But it has somehow allowed conservatives to have a monopoly on the language of community and patriotism and belonging. And here, Faiz, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, because I thought about this listening to Bernie Sanders' political speeches and his campaigns. I thought one element that was missing was connecting the critique of the structural inequalities that we have allowed to develop with the language of patriotism, community, and belonging. Why should patriotism be the monopoly of conservatives? So it seems to me that the Democratic Party needs to think through how to connect its economic message with evoking a sense of community and belonging, a sense of mutual responsibility among citizens.
Professor
that
Sandel,
I think has to talk about the nation, about what it is to be members of a shared political project.
I agree with it. And one of my favorite moments, he did this riff. It was one time. I wish he had done it more often. But it was along the lines of saying, are you truly free if you're drowning in student debt? Are you truly free if you can't afford the health care? And are you truly free if you can't get your kids to go to college because you don't have the money to do it? Are you truly free, if you're living paycheck to paycheck? And you go down the riff. And I thought it was an effort to try to reclaim the words freedom and liberty, to have the notions of what it truly means, taking this being American and honing in on American values of freedom and liberty and trying to reclaim those in the economic justice context. I think you're right that there's some, economic nationalism to care and truly economic democracy, particularly when you take on these large conglomerates who are multinational in scope and probably don't give a damn as much about the American workers as just cheap labor anywhere in the world, that you have to fight for an ethic of common, we're in this together and it is our lot, right, that we're fighting for.
Right. And to pick up on the language of freedom, this can be taken in two ways. One way of taking that is to say, no, as an individual, I'm not free, I'm insecure. And that's why we need universal health care and access to education and relief from college debt and so on. But there's a further dimension of freedom that I think we need to weave into a revitalized public discourse for progressives. And that is the idea that we are not only free as individuals, important though that is, really to be free requires that we think of ourselves as democratic citizens with a meaningful voice in shaping the forces that govern our collective destiny, that we see ourselves as engaged in a common project. So rebuilding a sense of American community and mutual obligation among citizens, that's a dimension of freedom, of civic freedom, that is lost if we focus only on enabling people to be free as individuals. Even going to a ball game is not the class mixing experience that it once was, to say nothing of downtown areas, to say nothing of schools and public schools.
We've lost the notions of civics, right? For many years, it was taught in schools, and what is your obligation? And we've boiled it down to the lowest level obligation: vote, right? But what might be beyond vote? What would it look like to have an engaged citizen? How do we get them to buy into this? How do we show them the path?
Let me give a couple of examples. The first one goes back to the late 19th century. For a time, the biggest most significant labor movement in the late 19th century was the Knights of Labor. And among their demands, in addition to seeking better wages and shorter working hours, better working conditions, they demanded reading rooms in factories so that workers on their breaks could read newspapers and magazines and inform themselves about public affairs, the better to equip themselves to be effective democratic citizens. Now, we've lost that civic dimension of freedom. Here's a very concrete and possibly controversial proposal that might address this. Universal national service, not only for the sake of performing needed tasks in health and education, as well as in military service and infrastructure reconstruction, but above all for the purpose of creating a class mixing experience for young people. Because I think it's not possible to realize a true notion of national community belonging if we occupy and live our lives in separate pods, largely divided by our educational status. Now, there was a time when military service, mandatory military service, provided a kind of class mixing experience. And we don't need to draft everyone into the military. But if you look even at the civic landscape of America, there are fewer and fewer public places and common spaces that gather people together across differences of class, race, ethnicity, and educational background. Fewer and fewer. Think of a concrete example. I'm a baseball fan, and I would go to when I was a kid to see a baseball game. And that was a place where CEOs and mailroom clerks sat side by side, more or less. The box seats were a little bit more expensive than the bleacher seats, but only by about $1.50. That was the difference. And everyone ate the same soggy hot dogs and drank the same stale beer, and everyone got wet when it rained. But now in the 90s and 2000s, most sports stadia have luxury skyboxes where VIPs can watch the game undisturbed in air-conditioned suites removed from the fans in the stands below. So even going to a ball game is not the class mixing experience that it once was, to say nothing of downtown areas, to say nothing of schools and public schools. So this, I think, this idea of restoring class mixing places within civil society, it's not a high matter of economic policy that presidential candidates discuss, but I think it's a necessary part of reweaving the social fabric that enables us to feel and enact a sense of solidarity as citizens.
One of the deteriorations around the unions, right, with the loss of unions in America, is that we don't have those mixing places that you've talked about, places where progressives in particular, people with a different mindset, outside of potentially a church that might appeal to conservative-minded folks, has been a building block for the right in many ways. What are those places of gatherings that people of progressive mentality and mindset might go? And the truth is there aren't that many. The gathering, the mixings of places is something we're missing. And I appreciate you kind of raising that as a kind of something we should hone in on, is how do we rebuild a community ethic with literally geographically putting ourselves into community with others?
I think we need to do a better job of equipping citizens to reflect critically on fundamental questions of justice and freedom and debates about equality and inequality and citizenship. But I also think it's important that democratic civic education be broadly diffused, not simply located in formal schooling or in higher education, but diffused throughout the society, which is why I love this example of the Knights of Labor asking for the reading room.
Right. Well, Professor Sandel, this has been a wonderfully enlightening conversation.
Thanks, Faiz.
Thank you. All right. Good talking to you.